But the good news is evangelism isn't dead. It's just changing. And that's why the Shock Absorber is such a positive podcast, because it's about adapting. It's okay. All these big changes are happening. How do we change? How do we keep our message the same? As Tim was saying, stay on that evangelical line, but let's preach the gospel in new and changing ways.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Shock Absorber podcast. We are here in the Third Space studio, and we are here with my two regular co-hosts, Tim and Stu. How are you guys?
Going really well, mate.
That's excellent. It's good to have you back, Tim.
Yes, thank you.
Did you have some time off?
I did. I was writing an essay during that time, but other than that, I had a good time off.
Real time off?
Real time off. No, it was nice to slow down a bit, which was really good.
Well,
yep.
Well-deserved rest to write an essay anyway. Thanks, Stu, how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks, mate.
That's good. You've told everyone on the staff team has a dog to bring a dog to work today?
Yeah, we thought we'd try something different today, which is bring a dog to work day. And my dog Abby's just sitting at my feet here, so I might just bring her up and introduce her to everybody.
Yes, please. Again, if you want to see this, you can check us out on YouTube. But she's very cute.
So this is Abby, everyone.
Yep. Make sure you don't hit this can of Coke off
Her
the
full
table.
name is Abbey Road, after the Beatles album. Because in our family we call all our dogs after something Beatles.
So her last name is after the Beatles album? Is that what you're saying?
So no, her formal name is, when she goes to the vet, is Abbey Road Crawshaw.
Right.
So yeah, this is Abby. She's a little cavoodle if you're listening.
How old is she?
She is 7 months.
Oh,
so she's only little.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's Abby.
Well,
Say Abby.
As a not a huge fan of dogs, I'm really enjoying today.
For those of you who are listening or even watching, in the other room, there's about 4 or 5 dogs, and there's another dog at the end of the table,
I've got Moriarty here.
Yep.
Which is
it's his second time on the podcast.
It is actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's dog heaven for me.
Yep. We'll leave it at that. All right, let's get back into our season of Whatever Happened to Evangelism. Episode 12, guys, of this season, which is very exciting.
Very exciting.
But Tim, I'm excited to have you back on the podcast because we talked about the 90s last week, and you're going to give us a perspective on the later 90s going into the 2000s, which is the kind of time that we're looking at today. But first of all, as always, we like to start with a story or a cultural artifact, and you've brought a couple along. Another prop like we did last week, which was great.
Yes.
And please take it away and tell us what you've got here.
Yeah, right. Well, I was thinking about what was it like as a teenager in the 90s, and what we want to talk about today is this idea that there was this whole really large subculture, all-consuming subculture of evangelicalism. And so I was kind of in there, but like Stu said last week about being a Gen X, and not being you can't really discern your own culture until you kind of a little bit removed from it. I thought that was really helpful that Stu talked about that last week. So I didn't really notice all of this at the time, but I could look back now and go, oh yeah, that was really weird, but kind of fun. So a couple of big things that were happening in this Christian subculture at this time, a couple of really massive albums. I'll hold this up for the camera for those on YouTube. So DC Talk, Jesus Freak album, that was a massive album in the mid-90s. I should have done some checks on these dates. 1998.
These are your CDs.
These are my CDs, yeah. CDs were this this sort of circular disc thing that replaced cassettes, so you didn't have to wind with a pencil when you got, it
got unspooled.
Yeah, that's right. No, so I mean that kind of places me very much as a millennial as well, the CD moment. And the other one was Newsboys, Take Me to Your Leader, which was also really key Christian subculture rock and roll. And there's one song on there called Breakfast, where they don't serve breakfast in hell. And it's just this... The album actually is really hilariously funny and intentionally hilariously funny. But they do a whole lot of really silly metaphors along there. And one of them is this idea of they're remembering a leader of theirs, a youth leader of theirs, who had passed away. But one of the things this youth leader had done was run a breakfast club for them. And so they're using all these really terrible death puns all throughout to sort of remember fondly their youth leader, but also talk about the fact that he's passed away, but also remembering this breakfast thing. And anyway, it's a big, complicated story. Those who know, we know. But
if you know, you know.
If you know, you know. Yeah. But those are two...
What are they saying on Facebook? If you know you were awesome or something?
I don't know. I haven't heard that one.
I think it's a meme.
Yeah, right. But if you were a Christian in the 90s, they were two kind of albums that were just everywhere. Everyone knew them. They were really, really big and popular. And the other thing that really came out in the 90s, which kind of defined this evangelical subculture, was Veggie Tales. So Phil Vischer was the creator of Veggie Tales, and he's got a whole story which I find fascinating. But one of the things that's really interesting there was he was trying to create... He saw himself as sort of a Christian Walt Disney. He was trying to create really engaging cartoon storytelling for Christians, but he had this idea of, the story starts that they were all candy bars to start with, so he had all these characters, all candy bars, retelling the Bible stories, and his wife walked past his room one day when he was editing on his computer and said, "No, parents are not going to appreciate you promoting candy bars with their children," and so he changed them all to vegetables instead. Really? Yeah. So he ends up with these Veggie Tales. But again, it was a massive cultural thing, and even the way he tells the story, he's making these videos for children, but the first generation to really capture them and understand them and really love them was actually sort of older teenagers and young adults, because he's got this very Monty Python-esque kind of humour, very sarcastic kind of thread all the way through, these little in-jokes which go over kids' heads. And so it was these teenagers that were kind of getting these first and really liking them. And he credits a lot of his success to the way that some of the really young crew in Christian bookstores would find these, think they were hilarious, and put them on the TVs to show to parents as they walk through the Christian bookstores. But that was a massive thing as well. So that kind of blew up, got really huge, big complicated story behind that, and it's still going now. But yeah, in terms of cultural moment, they were some of the really big things that kind of defined what it was like. As a Christian growing up in the 90s, they were some of the things that were really, really significant and would have been really, really popular. And as we go through today, we'll talk about those who are kind of reacting against the 90s, what it was like to sort of be that older millennial in the Christian ecosystem. And these are some of those kind of pop cultural moments that really resonate with those of us who were in the moment at that time.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Veggie Tales, because I remember when I was coming through youth group and stuff, people would be talking about Veggie Tales, but they were all people from Christian families.
Yes.
And because I was from a non-Christian family, I'm like, I don't know what this is.
No idea, yeah.
What are you watching a healthy TV show? That's what I thought they were doing. So it's interesting that you brought that up. Stu, we talked last week about your experience of the 90s, but I thought it would be fascinating to get Tim's perspective on the 90s, because there's a little, you're probably towards like more reached the kind of 20s age that we talked about with Stu at the later era of the 90s. What are you've brought some of the cultural moments of the 90s, but what are your memories of the 90s and your experience, I suppose, and you were growing up in a Christian family as well? Yeah,
so I graduated high school in 2000. So start of high school 94, 95. And so, yes, that was my high school years. So that demographically, that kind of puts me right in the cusp. There's actually a phrase people sometimes use called the Zennial, which is not quite Gen X, not quite a millennial. It's these couple of micro generations in the middle, from sort of 79 to 83, and that's exactly where I am. And so that was the kind of cultural moment. It was this cusp between two big epochs. So some of those big cultural moments for those of us who were teenagers in the late 90s, early 2000s, in that sort of older millennial age, was the Columbine High School massacre was a massive thing. So that was April 20, 1999. And because we were in high school at the time, I think that really shook us, even though culturally we're quite distinct from America. There was this, we were caught up in that moment, and that was a real big thing. It felt like it was really close to home, because as we listened to the commentary on that, we see a lot of the footage that came out of that high school massacre, and also because a lot of the commentary was around the cultural moments that were also happening around that time. So there was a lot of commentary whether the shooters were impacted by the Matrix movies and by Marilyn Manson.
Violent video games?
Video games, yeah. So you've got all of this commentary happening of basically our culture, our world. And it kind of, I think it may have been one of the first times that I was really aware that the news commentary was taking our culture really seriously and trying to investigate it and internalise it and think about what it was going on there. So that was a really significant moment for us. And the other one was the September 11 attack, so 9/11 in New York City. And that was really shaking for us as well, I think, culturally, as those who, we weren't old enough to remember the Berlin Wall. So even though that kind of happened in my lifetime, was it 89? 89, Berlin Wall comes down, the collapse of the Soviet Union and all of that. So I'm in primary school during that time, so I'm not really culturally aware that those things are happening. So I don't have that mindset of what it was like at the end of the Cold War and the relief that came from the Berlin Wall coming down and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm really coming aware culturally and socially, where we've just got what Francis Fukuyama talks about as the end of history, which is that capitalism won. And so we're just on this continuous uptrend where capitalism will just go from strength to strength. And that, I mean, in terms of our conversation, it's really interesting because capitalism, particularly during the Cold War years, had been closely tied to evangelicalism because it was this capitalist West and the Christianity that was linked with that versus the communist East and Soviet, which was atheistic and non-Christian. So you've got those things are being tied together really closely. But yeah, so September 11, for those who might need a catch up on that if you weren't aware. So that was the planes being hijacked by Islamic terrorists, being flown into the World Trade Center, which is these big, the highest skyscrapers on the New York City skyline. And it represented a whole lot of things. So it represented maybe this idea of the end of history and the continuous uptick of capitalism. Maybe that's not the actual story. And so it brings in a whole lot of fear of terrorism. Up until that point, terrorism, particularly from an American point, had been internal. So the biggest things had been the Oklahoma City bombings, which was all homegrown terrorists.
Waco, Texas and all
Waco,
that.
Texas, yeah. So you've got those things that happened. Now it was international terrorism, and all of a sudden we're aware of what international terrorism, and that's really new and really shaking. And so, it kind of laid waste this idea of maybe it's not just this continual end of history, isn't capitalism fantastic, it's going to go from strength to strength, but maybe there are still other forces in the world that are interacting with that and we need to take stock of. So for us as a worldview, it was quite shaking because we had only really had this sort of, growth out of Cold War mindset into, more and more goodness, I suppose, in some ways.
Progress.
Yeah, progress, yeah. And so that was really quite shaking. And I don't know if you guys, I remember where I was when I first heard. Well, it was I didn't hear about it till very early in the morning, but it was a uni day for me. I was on my way to uni. But my mum came and woke me up really early and said, you need to come and watch the TV now. We need to see what's going on. And we just sat there shell-shocked for ages, just trying to process. And it had been a few hours since it had happened. So there's a lot of commentary already happening. I think both towers had already fallen by this time. But just kind of watching it, unbelievable. Like, just you can't quite comprehend the scale of it. So that was really shocking. Do you guys have a memory?
I remember I was in the middle of high school, so I was actually in bed when it actually happened. But I remember the alarm that I had would wake me up with the radio, and I remember the radio, like, waking up going, what are they talking about? Like, what has happened? And then I woke up and spoke to my mum, and she's like, yeah, there's been a serious thing happened in New York. And my mum and dad were actually up watching West Wing, probably my favourite TV show at the time, which is really interesting. It's an American political show. And they were watching, and they interrupted that because they kept, obviously less and less people were watching West Wing, so they kept putting it later and later at night on Channel 9, I think. And so they interrupted that to switch to they actually saw the second plane fly into the second tower.
Wow.
And so they were up until 3 o'clock in the morning. And I just remember even going to school. I was in middle high school, so I would have been in year 9 maybe, year 9 or year 10. And just everyone at school was just like talking about it. It was all you would talk about all day. Because it was such a momentous event. Stu, do you remember this?
Yeah, I'd just gone to bed and my brother-in-law rang us and said he'd just seen it, and we got up and I saw the second plane go into the second tower, and then saw them both collapse, and it was pretty shocking. And then the Pentagon and the other plane, they didn't know where it was going to go, and it was pretty frightening.
Yeah. When you look back on it, you're just like, I cannot believe it happened. We spoke about last episode, Chuck Closterman in his book, The 90s, said that was the end of the 90s. And that fits in a lot with what you were saying, Tim, is that it was the end of a particular era. That attack, it signified the end of that era. I'm wondering, though, a couple of things that we looked at previously, and you also spoke about guns, Tim. I was just wondering, Stu, it's probably best for you to reflect best on this because it was in 1996, but the Port Arthur massacre, what do you think? What was your interpretation of that impact on culture, and maybe in contrast to what Tim was talking about in terms of Columbine and the questions that were brought up around the use of guns in America?
Yeah, Australia doesn't have the same gun culture as America, but there was a big massacre down at Port Arthur, which is a historic site down in Tasmania, which is the most southern state of Australia. There's a historic site where they used to put convicts, and people go there to this day to go and see the history there. And Martin Bryant drove there one day and shot a whole heap of people.
35
that were
people
visiting.
died and 23 injured, I saw. But the Port Arthur massacre is an example of how it was different in Australia and America, was that gun laws is a big topic in America, but in Australia they changed the gun laws after the Port Arthur massacre to the gun buyback scheme. So that was probably a difference between the two countries in terms of what was going on in their culture. Having said that, in the US, we always continue to look at that, how they're especially the Christian right interacted with politics and around the fundamentalism. George Bush won his second election in 2004, and actually a national exit poll showed that a large number of voters chose moral issues as their most important priority when they were voting, instead of looking at perhaps the Iraq War and post 9/11 economy. Same-sex marriage became a real political issue as some states moved to changing the laws on that. But interesting, though, because George Bush was elected for the second time, the Christian right leaders wanted to say that they actually had a real part in his victory in the election. Now, and that would probably be down the line of the fundamentalist tenet of the Christian leaders in America. But also there was a quote from D. James Kennedy, who was part of that Christian right. He said that now that values voters have delivered for George Bush, he must deliver for their values. As we say in Texas, he's going to dance with the one who brung him. And then went on to say, God has given us a short reprieve to reverse laws, pass bill amendments and reinstate values. And then so they saw there's a real opportunity to drive votes and to drive a push towards having more conservative judges on the Supreme Court and things like that. So to many evangelicals, this was a time as like not to evangelicals, to fundamentalists, is a time like we can get back our country again, which is obviously, we've talked about that before, even from the 70s and the 80s onwards. It was a time where they could actually, they wanted to bring back almost Christendom, is to bring back, we're a Christian nation, we wanted to reclaim that. By the time that, towards the end of George Bush's reign, though, that kind of movement, again, as we've seen a couple of times with the moral majority, met its downfall as a political influence began to wane. It was probably that movement was at its peak in around 2005, but then when the Republicans lost majority control of the Congress, then it started to see it move on the wane again. Stu, what are your interpretations of that time? Because it's a very different time, like that we're almost moving to a post 9/11 time now. Did you think that there was a clash in terms of it was the end of an era, as we were talking about, but then there's still the fundamentalists probably trying to bring back some of the things that they want to see?
Yeah, I think Tim's introduction with the Veggie Tales is a really good comment, because it took me by surprise when a whole bunch of kids that were coming out of kids ministry started singing Veggie Tales songs in youth group, and we were like, what's this? So the bands that Tim brought for us this morning were younger cuspers music, so they were really resonating with that. But some of the older teenagers were into MXPX and some of those other bands more than DC Talk and some of that. But I think what we saw was I started to notice that culture was changing faster. So Tim's generation coming through was definitely different to the teenagers that I was leading, and watching them interact with each other was interesting, because some kids would put Veggie Tales on at youth group and dance to it, and other teenagers are like, what is going on with this? So Nirvana fans all of a sudden being at a youth group where there's 5 years later there's Veggie Tales being played was a very stark contrast to Pantera and Tool and bands like that. So that was a really interesting thing, and it got me thinking about what Mark Center had written in his book, The Coming Revolution of Youth Ministry, because he argued that technological change brings cultural change. And so as change comes forward, the two things that cause change are big events like the end of the Berlin Wall or 9/11. Those kind of epochs create new cultures, but also the technological changes. So Tim was making a point of the CDs, that's also emerging at the same time as computers are available to people. And Tim was describing how the originator of Veggie Tales was sitting in his house with a computer making a product that would be then able to be distributed en masse around the world. And I think that's the digital change that we're starting to see coming in the 90s. That means that small actors can start creating mass content. And so things are changing quickly because of the computers and because of the internet, which is coming in. And just before these events that we've been describing, like 9/11 and Columbine and stuff, we've been introduced to things like the personal computer that can create video. We're also introduced to the internet. I remember my first browser was, I think, called Netscape, I think it was called, where I remember still sitting in the lounge room when someone said, Stuart, plug this into your phone and I'll show you that I can get you onto this thing called the internet. And in my lounge room on this guy's really chunky old laptop, we saw this browser come up for the first time.
And when you say phone, you're not talking mobile.
No, it wasn't a mobile. It was literally a landline into my computer. So Mark Center, I mentioned Mark Center, he said, interestingly in his book, that in his diagnosis of youth ministry and evangelism during the industrial age, he made the point in his book that was released in 1991 that it takes 50 years for there to be a cultural change. But I was witnessing not only 20-year changes from the baby boomers to Gen X, but also now I'm witnessing 10-year changes from within young teenagers that I'm ministering to and young adults having a really different culture. And I think that would accelerate during the 2000s. That I think culture's changing almost every 5 years now. So what the challenge that gives for us is, Center in his book argued for postmodern pluralistic ministry responses. So we need to have pluralistic postmodern evangelism to these different generations, if you like. So cuspers are different to Gen X, millennials will be different again. And his argument in his book that he wrote in 1991 was, is the future of evangelism going to be different targeted evangelism to different like groups, which is, I think, the necessary conclusion to the homogeneous unit principle, which was created in the 70s, which says, you know, young people have their own church service, older people have their own church service. Now younger people are different from each other, and not only tribally through different subcultures like skating and surfing, etc., but now demographically every 5 years the teenagers are very different from each other. And things like Columbine and 9/11 impacted Tim's generation, whereas my generation and the teenagers that I led subsequently were impacted by the Berlin Wall coming down. So you can see that as the internet speeds up, that's going to change as well. So it might even be worth for us to look at some of these different postmodern evangelism, I suppose, techniques in the context of this changing world, because as fundamentalists are continuing to argue for this political conversation to be continuing in churches, you've got a lot of really big ministries, evangelical ministries that are changing, and you're also getting new ones starting up that are coming, which we'll get to as well.
Well, it's just I was going to ask, just before you do that, you said that obviously you were leading young people and you were noticing that the speed of change was accelerating. What did you do yourself as a church leader to say, we need to adapt to this, and what did you do practically?
Yeah, because in the 90s I thought we were setting up something that would last a bit longer, but then as I saw it changing, then I read Center. That's why we came up with the shock absorber,
right?
Because the shock absorber was, let's build a mechanism within our ministry where young people are constantly telling us what they're so let's sit down and talk to Tim's generation about Veggie Tales, and let's get them to talk with the kids who are listening to Tool and to Pantera, and let's all work out some common ground where we can we can work together, and let's have the youth leaders as adult Christians who've spent a bit more time in the Bible, bringing theological perspective to bear to that conversation. And then we used to do that regularly. So we already had a mechanism that we set up in the 90s to do that. As we said in previous episodes, when I started out as a youth minister, my impulse was to listen to the young people and try and understand what difference Nirvana was making to them and those sort of things. And we call that the commitments. So what that was we got committed Christians who are in the group to meet before the group started for half an hour to an hour, just to have a pray and a read, but also have a talk about issues facing the community week to week. And we called that group the Commitments. And it was really cool that we had that set up in the 90s, because then in the 2000s, when Tim's generation comes on and then subsequent generations, we embrace them into the Commitments and said, as younger committed Christians, we are older committed Christians, but let's all talk together and let's see if this shock absorber idea can help us to change and help you to be embraced into our culture a bit as well. So the Veggie Tale thing went through for quite a while, and I think that it was something that people could embrace and understand, even if they didn't like the new stuff that the younger kids were coming through with.
Didn't you remember talking to people about Tool?
Well, it's interesting because I can remember the older guys at Soul Revival, like those who were like even just 3 or 4 years older than me, when they're into Pantera and Tool and Nirvana. I think I was a bit slow on the uptake on pop culture, but by the time I was really aware of pop culture, and I've said this in other episodes, but for me it was Blink-182, Green Day, Living End, and so we'd moved past that kind of that industrial and the grunge, and that was really old hat. And so I can remember guys at church with their Tool T-shirts on and listening to Pantera, and I was like, I don't really get that music, but give me some Blink-182 and some MXPX and I'm all over it.
And that's the challenge for the youth leaders, because we're trying to lead a change that's only 5 years.
Yeah.
We don't even have 5 years to work out what to do. These young crew that Tim's representing are completely different to these other crew that have come through. And so that's why the shock absorber was really good, because we're saying let's build a framework where we can do it formally and informally. So we'd have these formal conversations in the Commitments, but then informally we just work out how we move forward together and express our Christianity as a group. And that was the beginning of our intergenerational moment.
And one of the things I do remember growing up was that both talking up and down the generations. So we did feel listened to. Like when we brought a new MXPX or Value Pack or Goatee Hook album and said, youth leaders, check this out, it's something I'm really excited about. The youth leaders would be genuinely excited to share that with us and go, yeah, this is cool, like, let's listen to more of this. But then I also remember nights where there was one particular night at Rev, which was our year 9-10 youth group. We had the leaders would play one of their favourite Christian artists, and it was this real mixed bag of all sorts of things. Rich Mullins and Rebecca St. James, and there were some of these more CCM artists like Audio Adrenaline and Third Day, and then one guy, Dave, he played this kind of hardcore band, and that was the one that really captured my attention. I thought, this is fantastic. And so that got me into the real heavy edge of music, and particularly there was massive hard Christian music scene at the time through Tooth and Nail and Solid State that was going on. But that was all, but it was also a sharing down. So they were sharing their music that they really liked, but they were listening to us. I remember sitting around at Commitments time and just feeling genuinely listened to. So again, I can appreciate now what I was experiencing at the time, which was the shock absorber in place. It was, here I was as a 15-year-old, just being able to share with my youth leaders, and they're genuinely listening and they genuinely care and they want to have our views shape ministry and shape the way in which we do relationships, but feeling genuinely loved and cared for at that time as well. I think I've shared before that one of my moments that I remember was we had one of our Relo bashes was trying to get a whole lot of different age groups together.
Relo bash in Australia is relative party.
Yes.
A bash is a party, but Relo is a relative. So a Relo bash is like a relative party.
Getting all your relatives together and having a shindig.
A shindig.
So we had this shindig of all these, but it was also a band night. And I think what Stu mentioned, I think you mentioned last week, Stu, that this idea that when we did bands at Soul Revival, it wasn't as an attractional funnel method of, we hope a really cool band comes so that lots of people come so we can then share them about Jesus. It was, we are Christians and we love music. So let's party and have a band, because as Christians, we just love sharing music together. So from an outsider, and you talked about how the number of your peers would kind of look into soul revival and go, oh, you guys have been really incarnational.
Yeah, that's right.
And so from the outside, it kind of looks like they were trying to be incarnational. But even as someone who was experiencing that as a young person.
Which means like you do a culturally relevant thing and then people come to that we won't go into all the incarnational theory.
Yeah,
now,
yeah.
but
People can go back to previous episodes.
That topic. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. But yeah, I remember there being, 14, 15-year-old and, just having a mosh which is jumping up and down dancing. That was very popular in the 90s. But having a mosh with all these people of all these different generations and having Brad Ware there, who was probably twice my size, really smashed up against him. But it was in this way that was just really celebrating who we all are together.
It was more like a group hug, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. Yeah. There was a great love for each other.
Way,
appropriate, yeah. So that's what, as I was experiencing our revival through the 90s, that was definitely experiencing that, and now able to look back and reflect on, I can see that was a shock absorber in place. And in terms of what it meant for evangelism, one of the things I think, and we've talked about this on multiple episodes, but the idea that because we were excited about being Christians, there was this real natural and organic spread to our friends to invite them. Of course you want to invite your friends in because you're just really excited about this. Not the band because it's super cool, and not because what you do at youth group is the most exciting thing you could do on a Friday night, but it was because here's a group where I feel valued and belong, and I have purpose and meaning, and these adults are genuinely interested in me in really God-honouring and safe ways, and they care for my growth, and they also want to see me and my friends become Christians and get to know Jesus better. So of course you invite your friends into that space. And so, I think that was a real natural way in which we did do evangelism, which was come and check out this community who loves Jesus and loves me. And that's really awesome. And I feel really safe in that space and really excited about that space.
Yeah, I think that was definitely my experience too, obviously in later years. But that was definitely my experience. Stu, you mentioned before, to have a look at a few things that emerged once, kind of around the time of 9/11, and I think
so things changed and things emerged.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things I thought was that we spoke about the kind of the downfall of the Christian right, or at least their influence to begin with. But someone that rose to prominence around that time, or just after, was someone called Rick Warren, who became very famous with his Purpose-Driven Life book.
That's right,
and it was a massive seller. I think I read it sold over more than 50 million copies.
Yeah, and if we're going to talk about evangelism, we need to talk about Rick Warren for sure.
Yes, because he became a celebrity, he was on TV a lot. He seen as the new America's pastor, a name that was given to Billy Graham. So you can that makes a lot of sense in terms of the position and the standing that he had. So he started Saddleback Community Church, which was in California, with only 7 people in their living room, and then it became it's a very large church now. And they were inspired by Donald McGavran and Incarnational Ministry, and they ran what they were called seeker-sensitive services. Now, I'm wondering if you guys can kind of define that for me, what a seeker-sensitive approach would entail.
Yeah, so Rick Warren did a demographic approach. He demographically researched his area that he was planning his church into, and I can't remember the name he gave to it, but he picked an archetypal guy that would go to his church and called him something, and so they targeted their ministry to him and his family, and so that effect meant that all the communications they did was to communicate to this demographic, and it was I don't know exactly where Saddleback is. I think it's in
the Orange County,
Midwest. Is that Midwest?
No, I think it's
California, isn't it? Yeah. So California. So the idea was to have a real targeted ministry to that person and their families. And then that was also similar to another leader, Bill Hybels, who had started up in a small way too. He actually started when the Jesus movement started. He had a youth group in the Jesus movement in the early 1970s that started meeting in a theatre, a cinema, I think, to start off with, and then they became a massive mega church as well. So Saddleback, Willow Creek is the church that Bill Hybels started. These churches are starting to become seeker sensitive. So they're saying that baby boomers aren't likely to go to a church that's from their parents' culture, and so we need to take away the cultural boundaries between this new baby boomer generation and the gospel, and so let's make a baby boomer church, really. It was really focused on people driving in their cars to church. That was a really big part of it, because people lived in their nuclear families predominantly, and they drove everywhere, and so you needed to have a really big car park for this church, and it needed to be a good experience even as you drove your car into the church. So they had all these different new ideas that they were promoting, and Rick Warren, with his purpose-driven life, is still influential on evangelism and evangelicals to this day, because even though he did get politically active, he was very instrumental in reframing how even church leadership is set up. So in Australia, they've taken on these Rick Warren ideas in many big churches, and they call it the 5 M's. And I don't know what all 5 M's are supposed to be off the top of my head. I'm not an expert on this, but EV Church, particularly in Gosford and the Central Coast, really embrace this Rick Warren approach, and then they've become a popular proponent of the 5 M's model. And within the 5 M model, you sort of say, what are I think Rick Warren calls them purposes. What's the purposes that we need to be attaining as Christians, and then let's set up our church around those. So, the 5 M's takes those purposes and calls them things like magnification for music and singing, maturity, membership, and mission. Is that?
Yeah, so there's magnification, membership, maturity, ministry, and mission.
It'd be unreal if anybody listening or watching is using those 5M model to run their churches. But evangelism in that model is you just have one pastor who's looking after the mission for all the different congregations of your church. And so the idea is, how do we expand our churches? How do we make them bigger? And again, that was from the church growth movement in the 70s that you were mentioning. There's this sense of we need to grow our churches bigger. So Saddleback and Willow Creek were really influential. With the Seeker services, I remember back in 1991, Willow Creek had a conference at Darling Harbour in Sydney, and Bill Hybels and his team came out, and it was huge. There was this huge number of evangelical leaders in Sydney came and listened. And the big takeaway was, it's important that we don't just run a service for everyone. And their methodology was, you have a Seeker service on the Sunday for people who aren't Christians. So what would it look like to design a church service for non-Christians? And then you have a believer service during the week that is what the Christians go to for maturity. So there's this sort of separation of mission and discipleship that we're talking about on the podcast, because in Soul Revival we've tried to bring those two things back together in an intergenerational approach. So it's very different, but this is a homogeneous unit approach. Let's have a Seeker service for different age groups, so they have multiple Seeker services on a weekend for old people, young people, families, and then let's have good music, really professional quality, something that baby boomers will go, because there was this kind of a bit of a cringe for the Christian church that we weren't professional enough, we weren't as good as what people are seeing on TV or in concerts. We need to lift our game. So the Seeker services were lifting our game and making ourselves more professional. And so by the beginning of the 90s, that had reached a zenith, I suppose, around the world. It had become huge as a methodology from people like Rick Warren and Willow Creek. And I think there's a lot of people in Australia who are aspirationally hoping to build a mega church in places like Sydney. But that was interesting for me as a Gen Xer watching that, because I wasn't really connecting with a lot of the themes that were being taught to us as really crucial. And even back then, I don't think I was consciously thinking this, but subconsciously I'm thinking this is something that I think my parents' generation would get heaps into, but not Gen Xers, because I was less interested in church as an event and more interested in church as a community, I think. And so I think it's almost interesting that the Willow Creek phenomena starts to ebb in the 90s, and it was huge in the 80s. I mean, like you said, Saddleback became a mega church off 7 people. Willow Creek, similar number, became a mega church, with tens of thousands of people going. But then they really tried to work out, how do we do that for the next generation? And started to struggle in the 90s to perpetuate that model, which I think they probably thought this is going to last for decades. But again, they didn't take into account Centre's idea that culture's changing all the time. And I think Gen X caught the baby boomers by surprise, because I think definitely at Guymer Anglican Church where I was going, they just assumed that we would carry on the homogeneous unit principle and want to do that for forever, because this is such a great way of doing church. But we were like, oh, well, you've already changed church when you changed it from the traditional service to the homogeneous unit principle. We felt permission to have a go at changing it for our generation too. But then as we were changing it for Gen X, we were conscious that Tim's generation, only 5 years later, were already very different. And that's why the shock absorber theory to me is really important, that rather than setting up a model that you say, this is our model of church and now we're going to do this for 20 years, I think we need to be constantly preaching the same biblical message, but listening to young people and trying to continue to adopt our approach, particularly when a massive thing like 9/11 happens. That's going to change things.
Yeah. Any comments on Rick Warren and that kind of Saddleback Church and what Bill Hybels had in that period of time too?
No, just to echo what Stu is saying, that there's been a number of commentators have talked about how that church growth movement, that seeker-sensitive kind of movement, was very much a boomer expression of church, which is interesting. What we'll look at as we go on this episode is what then becomes the Gen X model as they also look, which is kind of interesting because at one point it's just the homogeneous unit principle again, right? It's the new generation trying to say, oh, well, we're going to make it relevant to our demographic.
Right.
But also the challenge that the different generations also bring. So trying to both be generationally relevant, but also break down the homogeneous unit at the same time, and how to hold those things in tension, and then not just Gen X models, but then what might millennial models of church look like, and how do they keep shaping?
I think the other interesting thing though is also Rick Warren in particular, his interaction on the political scene, and we spoke like it was more down the line of what Billy Graham was doing rather than trying to change everything. He hosted a presidential debate in 2008 between the two candidates, Barack Obama and John McCain, actually at his church, which was a televised event called the Civil Forum on Presidency. And Rick Warren himself was the moderator, which is really interesting. And Rick also gave the inaugural benediction when Obama was inaugurated in February 2008, I think it would have been.
Yeah, so it seems to be different to the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robinson kind of fundamentalists' reaction to politics. It seems more like Rick Warren, again, this is an outsider looking in, but he does seem to be more that Billy Graham. He's politically aware, he's politically and socially engaged, but he's not our political engagement is a fruit of discipleship, but the main game is bringing people to Jesus. So we bring people to Jesus. We do, like the seeker-sensitive service is really clear on that. Like we want to make people feel comfortable at church so that we can remove all the barriers so that they can hear the gospel of Jesus clearly. And so that's the evangelical impulse, I think, there. That is, it's about Jesus. It's about bringing people to know Jesus. But as he's seeking to have sort of a holistic discipleship of the people in his church and recognizing that he has more of a platform than just his own church, it's also saying, well, as Jesus followers, how does that shape all the different things that we do? So there's a number of different offshoots at Saddleback that engage with a lot of different social questions, and one of them is things like this political engagement. But yeah, one of the differences we've pointed out over the last few episodes is that the fundamentalist impulse is let's change the country for Christ through political means. Whereas the evangelical impulse is, no, let's change people through the gospel of Jesus, but that will have an outflow. And so it seems, the way that he can bring these two different candidates together, both the Republican and the Democrat in the same space, that he can be a Christian giving a benediction to a Democratic president, which in some fundamentalist circles would be complete anathema. How could you possibly stand on the same platform as someone who was a Democrat? Because don't we know that all Christians are in this bundle of Republican, conservative,
and
political...
that's the fundamentalist view. The evangelical view is to bring the two candidates into your church so they can debate together.
Yeah, and have this
and
through
influence.
line.
I think there would have been something in the back of his mind. might be presumptuous with this, but he's almost thinking, can we influence these two guys for Christ in that? Because the megachurch movement was taking the Billy Graham crusades and bringing them into churches. So there are a number of megachurches across America that were like big Billy Graham rallies every week. And so the reason they had seeker services on the Sunday is because they were preaching the gospel every Sunday so that people would become Christians every Sunday.
Yes.
And then discipling them during the week. So, yeah, Tim, I think what you're describing there with the two candidates coming into Saddleback would have been an evangelistic opportunity for Rick Warren in his mind, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. And again, one of the things you see in Billy Graham's life is that he was quite friendly and had influence on nearly all the presidents during his lifetime and during his ministry, irregardless of what platform they were on and which party that they were part of. He saw that as part of his ministry was to, as America's pastor, to actually speak to the presidents. But because he had this evangelical through line, he, for most of his life, I think was it Nixon or Reagan, he got very close to one of the presidents and then kind of backed away, realised that he kind of made a mistake.
Well, Nixon was Nixon was
Nixon,
got himself into serious trouble, and ended up resigning
under Watergate.
Well, yes, you've got all that. So I think that era kind of made Billy Graham realise, oh no, hold on, I got a little bit too close, but he was still close. And when at Billy Graham's funeral, you had a number of presidents speaking about their thankfulness to him that he had just kind of pastored them. He'd been in the room with them. He was happy to pray with them and read the Bible with them. And again, as we talk about this, what's the history of evangelicalism? That there's that through line that's not trying to take partisan position, but just to be present in the political sphere, but without using politics to drive change.
And I think I found a quote from Rick Warren which kind of summed up the way he was thinking, which we're trying to understand. He says, the Bible calls the church the body of Christ. And what has happened in the last 100 years is the hands and feet have been amputated and the church has just been a mouth. And primarily it's been known for what it's against. But I think what he was trying to do is obviously bring those two candidates together and to start influencing the way that you guys are talking about it. Another thing that you brought up before, Tim, when you were talking about Veggie Tales and a couple of CDs that you brought in terms of the cultural artefact was the evangelical subculture that you said that you can almost become ensconced in. What did you mean by that? And was that something that happened in Australia, or is it just purely was it more based around American subculture? Yeah,
I'm trying to just interrogate my own experience, but also what I see of others of my generation as I listen to them. Now that we're in our late 30s to early 40s, there's obviously a lot of these people have voices. They're on social media. They're writing commentary and books and these kind of things. So there's a lot of discussion and trying to deconstruct what the experience was growing up. So a lot of these voices are American, and we have this American subculture, which, all of these things I brought in are all American products. And there was some Australian version. So I don't think the evangelical subculture was as deep in Australia. I think we got some of the fruits of it, I suppose you could say. We got some of the products that were there, the bands, the TV shows, the T-shirts, there were some things that we were in. But as I listen to some of my peers from America, it does seem there's quite a deep evangelical subculture going on there. And this is really becoming apparent as a lot of my generation are part of what's called the ex-evangelical movement. And so these are people who are moving away from the definition of evangelical that they've grown up with, which is all of this cultural stuff. There's TV shows, there's schools, universities. You could go through to your late 20s and still be completely immersed in this subculture of evangelicalism. Because, again, there's numbers in America. It's also culturally, there's more of that longer Christian heritage. But you can go to all of these things. You can be fully immersed in evangelical subculture for all of your life and not really have an outside voice critiquing or speaking into your experience. And so a lot of my generation are getting into their late 20s to mid 30s and realising, hold on a sec, there's a bigger world out there. And also we're not quite sure if we believe all of these things that were bundled together. So I said 2 weeks ago that it's this bundling that is causing a lot of stress, I think this is my kind of personal assessment of it, is that people are realising that they've been told there's a message of Jesus, which is also loving Veggie Tales and DC Talk and MXPX, and it's also going to these particular Christian schools, and it's also having this particular political framework, and it is also being, the moral majority and having these particular positions. And so when you have you've been told that Christianity, that to be an evangelical is all of those things, and some of that is very much in the fundamentalist camp, then you've got these people who are saying, well, I'm not a fundamentalist, or maybe I'm not as conservative as these values, or maybe I like these other bands that are not part of evangelical subculture, or maybe I have different values. And so you have all of these different experiences that people are wrestling with, and sort of stepping outside of what they're calling evangelical, but I think we're trying to diagnose and say is more fundamentalist. But they're not quite sure where to land, because if you've been told that all of this package is a bundle altogether, then does that mean that if I'm not, on the far conservative side politically, does that mean I'm not a Christian and I can't be friends with Jesus anymore? And for some people, it seems that those two things are so wrapped up together that they think, well, if I'm not hyper conservative, then maybe I can't be a Christian. And so they're then trying to find out where they are in the world. And so Stu talked a couple of weeks ago about a number of Gen Xers finding that space at L'Abri to kind of deconstruct their faith and their experiences and try and work out what does it actually mean to follow Jesus? Can I still be a Christian and have some of these things? And I think the evangelical moment seems to be the millennials L'Abri type moment. It's the trying to wrestle and find out what that means. And for some, it's landing completely outside of faith. I'm not a believer. I don't believe in anything anymore. For some, it's maybe I'm a really broad Christian, and they might be landing in more of a progressive Christian camp, which might have, when we talked about the modernist fundamentalist debate, where the modernists at the Scopes Monkey Trial were more liberal, progressive in their theology and their understanding of Scripture. Some are landing there. Others are saying, well, maybe I'm going to more liturgical churches, because a lot of the evangelical churches, like Saddleback and Willow Creek, Seeker Sensitive, aren't very liturgical, but they're finding a home in Anglicanism or Catholicism or some of these other traditions that have a lot more of the bells and smells and the stand up, sit down and corporate prayers, and actually finding that interesting and different. And then there's others, which I think are representative of this through line of evangelicalism, who are trying to say, okay, I recognise that bundling, particularly the bundling with a lot of fundamentalist ideas, is not all there is to say about Christianity. There is actually a Christianity outside of fundamentalism, and who are trying to walk this middle road. And the problem that they're facing, as I kind of look in on the commentary, is those who are on the very progressive side of Christianity look at them and say, well, you're still really conservative because you still believe all the core tenets of the Christian faith. But those who are in the fundamentalist camp look at them and say, well, you're super woke and progressive because you've moved away from our fundamentalist definition of what it means to be a Christian. And so you've got a whole lot of authors and podcasters and speakers in this space who are trying to work out what is this new evangelicalism. And as I look back on history, the conversations we had about people like Billy Graham and Christianity Today, Fuller Seminary, Wheaton, all those kind of guys who were trying to think after the Scopes Monkey Trial, what's this new evangelicalism, and trying to reclaim that label that's not fundamentalist and it's not modernist. It seems to me we're in a very similar moment, and that my generation seems to be wrestling with these ideas of what does it mean to not be fundamentalist, but we don't want to be progressive because we want to hold on to the tenets of the faith, but we're not quite sure how to distinguish ourselves, and at the same time getting battered around by both sides.
Yeah, Tim, that's really interesting because, again, hearing it from your perspective as a cusper between millennials and Gen Xers, I think is a fascinating perspective. You mentioned L'Abri with Gen Xers and cuspers going to L'Abri in 2000. I was seeing millennials and, these cuspers and Gen Xers all struggling with what it meant to be a Christian. Another thought that I had as you were speaking was that I was talking to Tim Hawkins, who was the youth minister of the biggest youth group in Sydney back in the early 90s, and his group was about 650 teenagers at Castle Hill Anglican Church. And during the 90s and into the 2000s, though, that group pretty much halved. And I said to Tim at a conversation I was having with him, Tim, what do you put that down to? Why do you think your youth group's shrinking from its heights in the 90s to where it is in the early 2000s? And he said when we were just having, not just, but when all our teenagers went to state schools, we had lots and lots of Christians in the state schools. We had a big ministry in the state schools, and they were asking their friends to come to the youth group. But then over time, the parents were embracing what Tim was talking about as the evangelical subculture, and one of the aspects of the evangelical subculture was Christian schools. And so a lot of parents started pulling their kids out of state schools because they were worried about the secular influence of the state schools on their kids, and they wanted to put their kids in a Christian school, so they were brought up as Christians rather than in a state school. And so the impulse for youth ministers in the early 90s was to encourage parents to obviously do what's best for each individual child, but to not give up on the state system, because we felt like for evangelism, that was having a massive impact on, our decision to disciple our children more wholeheartedly in a Christian school during their Christian, time as a primary school kid and then a high school kid. So Christian schools are great for Christian kids to go to, but one of the impacts of that is that Tim Hawkins pointed out that the Christian kids aren't in the state schools anymore, and talking to their friends and being in that context and sharing conversations with them in that context. So the interesting thing from hearing from Tim is some Christian teenagers who go into those Christian schools then rebel against that package or that, that modelling of all that stuff thrown together. And so, there's a double impact actually, isn't there? Because a lot of teenage kids actually leave the church when they hit the end of high school. And what was also interesting about what you were saying, Tim, is that the whole story of Veggie Tales was a Christian subculture being brought into our youth group from the children's end, because in our context, not many of our teenagers went to Christian schools when you first came along, and they were all from state schools. 80% of our youth group were made up of kids who'd made a commitment to Jesus in their high school years, but then all these children that came through from Christian schools into our youth group came in with this Christian subculture. So the conversation wasn't just about a cultural change from 5 years. It wasn't just all kids in your age group were listening to Veggie Tales. It was the Christian kids going to Christian schools that were listening to Veggie Tales. And then we were trying to work out, how do we absorb that culture and how do we work with that Christian culture? We're Christians, but we didn't have Veggie Tales, and so we didn't have all that bundling. So, I think next episode of the podcast we're going to be talking more about that progressive impulse, that ex-evangelical context that Tim was talking about, and it's really interesting to look at that in the context of evangelism that takes place after 9/11, and evangelism gets reframed in our society as proselytization, and there's a big fear of the influence that faith leaders have on young people after 9/11 because of the rise of terrorism. There's this fear of radicalisation, and the fear of radicalisation is implied across all faiths. And as we'll talk about next week, we're also going to come across the new atheists that are becoming more and more aggressive in their criticism of not only Christians and the Christian church, but God himself and the Bible. And so that's going to change the whole environment of evangelism. So we talked last episode about this big spike in evangelism through the 90s, but in the 2000s, there's going to be this period of time where many people are starting to question, is evangelism actually dead? Because we're going to have more and more restrictions on people to share their faith in schools. More and more kids are being pulled out of state schools into Christian schools from churches, and the new atheists are going to be attacking the Christian position, and more Christians are going to be seen not as these harmless daggy people who try and stop my kids listening to rock and roll. They're starting to become seen as dangerous people, and to share your faith with someone is increasingly going to be seen as more and more problematic, which would be really interesting to unpack next podcast.
Yeah, I think you've done a really good job of setting us up for next week. I just wanted to ask one question around that emergence of the Christian subcultures. Do you think that was a reaction to, we talked about a lot of things collapsing towards the beginning of the 90s and then coming to the 2000s. Do you think that was a reaction to you mentioned last episode REM's "Losing My Religion." Do you think
Yeah.
that was a way? I mean, I found some data on from the General Social Survey that said even between 1991, when 87% of young adults said they were Christian, whether it would be Catholic or Protestant, to 1998, 7 years later, the share of within that 18 to 35-year-olds had dropped 14 percentage points to 73%. So I think the reason I ask that question is if faith is supposedly dropping off, but then we talked about the surprising evangelical awakening last episode. I'm just trying to pass those two things together. Why do you think is that why that Christian subculture emerged?
Yeah, I think what we're looking at is a few things. The baby boomer culture was evangelizing in America, evangelizing an evangelical culture. So there was this sense of calling people to come home if they'd abandoned the faith, like come back to the faith. So, the saddleback idea of looking at some, young family dad with his kids, this guy's probably gone through Christian Sunday school, Christian youth group. He's gone to university or college, and he might have even come back, maybe not going to church anymore. It's like, let's win them back to something they know. But increasingly, like you said, there's this end of Christendom that's taking place, and we trace that all the way back to the beginning of the Enlightenment as a long-term journey. But we also looked at the epoch in the 60s where there was a massive turn away from baby boomers from the church, so much so that there was that Time magazine article in the 60s that said, "Is God dead in America?" But yet that was, again, there was a surprising revival in the early 1970s with the Jesus movement where thousands and thousands of young people became Christians and came back to church, and there was a new Christian subculture born out of that moment of the Jesus movement in the early 70s with contemporary Christian music creating the kind of products that Tim's talking about. Christian bookshops are now producing what some people started to term by the late 70s Christian junk. There was stickers, T-shirts, honk if you love Jesus. You could what?
Buy mugs.
Buy mugs, yeah. Jesus
like,
loves you, all this sort of stuff. It was all pitched as evangelism, but by the 80s it had started to look really cheesy. But the Christian music industry in the 80s was so massive that it was such a big money earner with contemporary Christian music, and that starts to reach its epoch with Tooth and Nail in the early 1990s. And so Tim's coming out of this Christian subculture in some senses because he's been brought up in a church with a Sunday school and going to Christian school, which are all great things, but he's been immersed in this subculture which is starting to wane by the 1990s. And so we talked last week about artists in the 90s saying they weren't so much wanting to be Christian bands anymore, like with contemporary Christian music, but they wanted to be Christians in a band. So there's already this secularization there. But at the moment that this is all happening, Christians, particularly in Sydney where we live, are moving more and more towards discipleship, almost trying to strengthen that Christian subculture, which is a good impulse to have discipleship. But we talked about No Guts, No Glory last week being an instance where there were many Christian youth leaders in Sydney saying, stop having big missional outreaches on a Friday and just have a Bible study with 4 kids on a Sunday afternoon and get them to ask their friends. But what ended up happening, by 2000, the number of newcomers coming to church is actually starting to decline quite dramatically in Sydney Anglican circles. And so the number of newcomers is declining because 70% or plus of people who make a profession of faith in Sydney do so in their teenage years or their childhood years. So if you're taking Christians out of state schools and the Christian youth groups have become more discipleship orientated towards Christian teenagers, and you've got Christian kids going to Christian schools more often, which means that sometimes they don't even go to youth group because their parents are saying, well, they're getting their Christian discipleship at school. There's less and less opportunity for these Christian children and teenagers to be sharing their faith with their friends. And so the number of opportunities for evangelism is decreasing as the number of people who come to church is also decreasing. So once upon a time it was culturally relevant for people to get married in a church, but increasingly now not many people get married in churches anymore. So we're just seeing this focus on discipleship as our culture moves further away from Christ, so that by the mid-2000s, around 2007 I think it was, we've said this before, but the Catholic Church came out with a survey that said that there's, it was called the Spirit of Gen Y, which was an early tagline for the millennials. But the Spirit of Gen Y was that the baby boomers were less spiritual than their parents. The Gen Xers were less spiritual than their parents, which is what you're indicating with the losing my religion. But the worrying trend was that what we'll talk about next week is into the 2000s, the millennials and the cuspers that Tim is a part of are becoming less spiritual again. So it's really interesting that study didn't come up with that people are still spiritual, but they're just cranky at organised religion. By 2007, 2008, people are less spiritual. They're less interested in spiritual things. And interestingly, more and more Christian young people are part of that generation that's becoming less spiritual. And even though there's a higher and higher focus on discipleship of them, they're becoming, many more of them are becoming dissatisfied with evangelicalism and starting to lose the faith as well. So that's a really interesting moment, and why we've phrased this episode, is this the death of evangelism? Because of all these huge challenges that are now emerging by the turn of the century. But the good news is evangelism isn't dead, it's just changing. And that's why the Shock Absorber is such a positive podcast, because it's about adapting. It's okay, well, these big changes are happening, how do we change? How do we keep our message the same? As Tim was saying, stay on that evangelical line, but let's preach the gospel in new and changing ways.
Yeah, well, I think we've got plenty more to go on with coming up in the new episode. We've got like the emerging church. We can talk about progressive evangelism. We've mentioned the church planting movement that came out of that almost as a reaction as well, and also the new atheists who had a big impact on evangelism too. So that's plenty of things to go on. We planned to have some of those things in this episode, but we went for the full hour, so we're like, we'll move on to the next episode. Thank you very much for everyone that's been listening or watching. We really appreciate it. As always, you can always jump in on the conversation. Thanks to Miles, who chucked a YouTube comment on there on the last episode. You can send in any questions you may have to joel@shockabsorber.com.au. You can subscribe to our email newsletter at shockabsorber.com.au. You can subscribe to the podcast and subscribe on YouTube. Soul Revival Church is our YouTube channel. We'll have a Discord server where we like to chat about things. If you're keen on doing that, the link for that will be in the show notes. You may also want to check out the Soul Revival shop, where any profits that we make from that would go to our Indigenous ministry partners. We actually had someone buy a Love God, Love Others shirt, so you might want to check that out. And that's it, guys.
Thanks, Joel.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for leading us so well week to week, mate. That was excellent.
That's all right. No, I'm having a great time, as always. So thank you very much. We should finish with a one way.
One way.
One way.